I didn't start this investigation thinking about train stations. To me, they were just part of the background of modern life, symbols of progress, reminders of the industrial age. Places where people passed through, not places you stopped to question. But the deeper I looked into the history of global rail infrastructure, the more certain details began to feel off. Not small inconsistencies, big ones, the kind that force you to pause and ask a question you never planned to ask. What if railroads were not built for the purpose we think? Let's start with something familiar. Take Grand Central Terminal, completed in 1913. Look up at the ceiling. A massive astronomical mural stretches across the main concourse, covering over 12,000 square feet. It shows the night sky with more than 2,500 stars, painted in gold leaf against a deep blue-green background. Now step back and look at the space itself. The concourse is enormous, about 275 feet long, 120 feet wide, and rising to 125 feet high. The walls are lined with marble. Sculptures and decorative elements fill the space with a level of detail you would expect in a cathedral. Not a transportation hub. Now compare that to Leipzig Hauptbahnhof, completed just 2 years later in 1915. It is the largest terminal station in Europe by floor area. More than 8 acres sit under one roof. The facade stretches nearly 1,000 feet, with multiple towers rising above it. Inside, the vaulted roof above the platforms climbs over 100 feet into the air. All of this for steam trains. Then look at Chhatrapati Shivaji Terminus, completed in 1887, often described as a cathedral of steam. It combines Gothic Revival architecture with Indian design elements. Domes, spires, stained glass, carved stone figures. Surface is detailed. The central dome rises more than 200 feet. This is not just a train station. It looks like a palace now. Here is the official explanation. These buildings were symbols of national pride. They represented industrial power, economic growth, and optimism about the future. Countries competed with each other through architecture, and money was no object when prestige was involved. That explanation makes sense at first, but then you notice something strange. It wasn't just a few cities doing this. It was everywhere, across Europe, Asia, North America, South America, Africa, and Australia. Cities built train stations that followed the same pattern. Large-scale, ornate design, cathedral-like interiors. Cities like Paris, Milan, Madrid, Tokyo, Melbourne, São Paulo, and Cape Town all built structures that looked far more like temples or government palaces than transportation hubs, and they did it within roughly the same time period, about 60 years. That is where the pattern begins, and once you see it, it becomes very difficult to ignore. Now let's zoom in on what was happening during that period. Between 1850 and 1920, the United States alone built more than 1,000 substantial train stations. Not simple wooden platforms or small shelters, but permanent structures made from stone, brick, and steel. Many of these buildings included clock towers, massive waiting halls with ceilings over 40 feet high, and decorative facades that required skilled labor and significant resources. What makes this even more unusual is where these stations were built, not just in major cities, but in small towns with populations of 5 or 10,000 people often had stations large enough to handle several thousand passengers at once. Rural stops featured arched windows, detailed brickwork, copper roofing, and carefully designed ventilation systems. This raises a simple question. Why build something so large and complex for such a small demand? The common answer is optimism. Rail companies expected rapid growth. They competed with each other and building bigger, more impressive stations was a way to attract passengers and investors. That explanation sounds reasonable, but it comes with a hidden assumption. It assumes that hundreds of independent railroads, companies, many of them competing directly, somehow ended up building very similar structures, similar layouts, similar proportions, similar materials, even when they were separated by thousands of miles. Look closely and you start to notice repeating details. The same types of clock towers, the same window designs, the same roof angles, the same proportions in waiting halls. It begins to feel less like independent design and more like a shared template, as if different builders were following the same general plan. Now let's ask another question. How were these buildings powered? The official answer is simple. Steam and coal. Coal-fired boilers produced heat. Gas lighting was used at first, later replaced by electricity as it became available. Standard industrial technology. But when you examine the scale of these buildings, the explanation starts to feel incomplete. Take heating. For example, large terminals like Gare du Nord, Union Station, or King's Cross Station had to maintain comfortable temperatures in enormous interior spaces. We are talking about volumes comparable to cathedrals. Heating that much space using coal would require huge boiler systems, constant fuel supply, and large teams of workers to maintain it. It would also produce a massive amount of smoke and residue, and yet early photographs show something different. Clean marble, clear glass, interiors that look almost untouched. Where is the soot? Where are the massive boiler rooms? Where is the infrastructure needed to support that level of heating? It should be visible, but in many cases, it is not, at least not at the scale you would expect. This leads to another detail that becomes harder to ignore. Electricity. Official timelines say many stations were electrified gradually. First lighting, then systems, then full integration. But when researchers looked at original architectural plans, something unusual appeared. Some buildings seemed to have electrical pathways built into them from the start, channels, inside walls, spaces that resemble equipment, rooms, layouts that suggest planned electrical systems even before large-scale power grids existed in those areas. Why design for electricity before it was widely available? That question doesn't have a clear answer, and it's where the story begins to shift from architecture to something much larger. When you go deeper, the real problem isn't the architecture, it's the energy. The official explanation sounds simple. These stations ran on steam. Coal-powered boilers handled heating. Gas lighting came first. Then electricity was added later as technology improved. That fits the timeline we've all been taught. But when you actually examine the infrastructure, the story starts to fall apart. Take the heating systems alone. These terminals weren't small buildings. They were massive enclosed spaces with ceilings rising over 100 feet high, holding enormous volumes of air. To keep them warm through winter using 19th century steam technology would require a constant massive supply of fuel. That means huge boiler rooms, continuous coal delivery, teams of workers operating around the clock, ventilation systems strong enough to remove smoke and toxic gases. But when you look at historical photographs, something is missing. The interiors are clean, white stone, polished surfaces, glass ceilings, all intact, all bright. No heavy soot buildup, no signs of industrial-scale coal burning inside or even nearby. No evidence of the kind of infrastructure required to support that level of heating. It doesn't match. So the next question is obvious. When did electricity actually arrive? According to official records, many of these stations were electrified in phases. First lighting, then machinery, then full systems. In some cases, this transition supposedly took decades, but when researchers looked at early architectural drawings, they found something unexpected. Electrical conduits built directly into the structure, not added later, built in from the beginning. Channels inside walls, spaces designed for equipment that resembles electrical systems, rooms positioned like substations, yet labeled vaguely as storage or mechanical areas. Why would you design for electricity before it was widely available? Some stations appear to have had advanced electrical systems from the moment they opened. Not just lighting, but elevators, signaling systems, and full operational support, all functioning immediately. And when you compare that to the development of local power grids, the timeline doesn't line up. In several cases, stations were consuming large amounts of electricity before nearby infrastructure existed to supply it. The records mention power sources, but only in vague terms. Municipal supply, private generation, no clear locations, no detailed plans, no physical evidence that matches the scale required. That silence is hard to ignore. And then there's time itself. Before railroads, time wasn't standardized. Every town followed its own local solar time. Noon was based on the sun's position, and it varied from place to place. That worked fine until trains needed schedules. So in 1883, railroad companies across the United States did something extraordinary. They created time zones, not gradually, not regionally, instantly. On a single day, competing companies, many of them rivals, all agreed to adopt the same system. 4 time zones applied across an entire continent. No government mandate at first, just coordination, and people followed. Daily life shifted. Work hours, meals, routines, everything aligned to railroad time instead of the sun. That's not a small change. That's a complete restructuring of how society experiences time. So now you have 3 things happening at once. Massive buildings with unexplained energy systems, electrical infrastructure appearing earlier than expected, and a nationwide shift in how time is measured, coordinated by the same industry. At some point you have to ask, were the railroads really just about transportation? Or were they part of something larger? Now take that question one step further. Look at the rail network itself from above. It spreads outward from major cities like spokes on a wheel. Steel tracks running in parallel lines for thousands of miles, connecting every major population center and most minor ones. A continuous system of metal conductors laid with precision, repeating the same structure again and again at first glance. It's just infrastructure for trains, but step back, and the pattern starts to resemble something else. A grid. Think about what those rails actually are. Long stretches of metal running side by side, separated at consistent distances, supported by insulating materials like wood. If you were trying to design a large-scale transmission system, something capable of moving energy across vast distances, this is not far from what it might look like. Now, consider the timeline. By the late 1800s, the rail network was already largely complete. Cities were connected. Routes were established. The physical framework was in place. But the electrical grid, as we understand it today, didn't fully develop until decades later. So the question becomes uncomfortable. Why did a global system resembling a conductive network exist before the widespread need for it? And why were the terminals, the stations, built like central hubs? Those massive halls, maybe they weren't just waiting areas. Those towers, maybe not just decorative. Copper roofing, unusual grounding structures, symmetrical layouts, details that seem excessive if the goal was simply to move passengers. But what if the goal wasn't just transportation? What if these buildings were designed to receive, regulate, or distribute something? Once that idea enters your mind, the architecture starts to look different, not ornamental, functional, not excessive, necessary, and here's where it becomes even harder to explain. This didn't happen in one country, it happened everywhere, across Europe, North and South America, parts of Asia, Africa, Australia, within a relatively short window of time. Cities across the world began constructing nearly identical systems, grand stations, expanding rail lines, standardized layouts, similar materials, similar design logic, all before modern global communication existed. No internet, no fast communication. Travel between continents took weeks, and yet the same patterns appear again and again, as if different civilizations were following the same set of instructions. That level of coordination shouldn't be possible, not at that scale, unless the knowledge didn't originate locally, unless it was shared or inherited. This is where some researchers introduce a controversial idea, not as a proven fact, but as a possibility, a placeholder for something missing in the historical record. They call it a lost system, a previous level of technology, something that existed before the timeline were taught, and left behind structures that were later repurposed. In that context, the railroads start to look less like an invention, and more like an adaptation, a system built on top of something older, and then there's another detail that keeps surfacing. Old photographs, images from the 19th century showing buildings partially buried, windows below ground level, doorways leading into what should be basements, but look more like original entrances. Entire city blocks appearing sunken. The common explanation is gradual urban development, rising street levels, sediment buildup, but the pattern is global. The same visual evidence appears in city after city, across continents. Structures that seem to have been adjusted after the fact, as if something changed the ground level faster than expected. And many early stations show signs of this to lower levels that don't match the current design. Structural elements that only make sense if the building once stood at a different height. So now the timeline becomes even more uncertain. Were these stations built after that change? Or did they exist before it? And if they existed before, what were they originally for? Because if the foundation of the system doesn't match the official story, then everything built on top of it becomes harder to explain. The rails are still there. The stations are still there. But whatever system they were part of doesn't seem to be, at least not anymore. Asterisk. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped by the 1920s. The era of building grand train stations was over. New stations were still constructed, but they were different, simpler, more practical, focused purely on transportation. The ornate designs faded away. The massive halls disappeared. Marble and copper were replaced with concrete and steel. Function replaced. Presence, whatever drove that earlier wave of construction, was gone, and the old stations, many of them were demolished, not abandoned, not left to decay naturally, torn down deliberately. Buildings that took years to construct, filled with materials and craftsmanship that would be nearly impossible to replicate today, removed within decades. New York's original Pennsylvania Station, gone. Chicago's Grand Central Station, gone. Philadelphia's Broad Street Station, gone, and dozens more. The official reasons vary. Urban development, maintenance costs, changing needs. But the pattern is consistent. The largest, most elaborate structures were the ones most often removed or heavily altered. The ones that remained were renovated, modern systems installed, original features stripped out, interiors redesigned. Whatever infrastructure once existed inside these buildings, replaced, simplified, or erased. If there was something unusual about them, it didn't survive the upgrades, and that raises a difficult question. Why remove so much, so quickly? Because if these buildings were simply oversized train stations, there would be no reason to eliminate the very features that made them unique. Unless those features served a purpose, we no longer use or no longer stand inside one of the surviving terminals today and look carefully. The symmetry, the repeating patterns, the scale that goes far beyond practical necessity. It doesn't feel accidental, it feels intentional. Like a system designed with rules we no longer recognize. Some have suggested these were energy hubs. Others believe they were part of a larger network, something involving resonance, transmission, or distribution. There's no definitive proof for those claims, but there are enough unanswered questions to make the standard explanation feel incomplete. Why build so big, so fast, and then stop? Why standardize time across entire nations almost overnight? Why design electrical infrastructure before the grid existed? Why do similar structures appear across continents with no clear coordination? And perhaps the most important question, why is there so little detailed documentation for projects of this scale? An era known for record-keeping somehow left behind gaps, where the most important technical explanations should be, not missing entirely, just incomplete, and that's where this leaves us. Not with answers, but with a pattern of advanced construction appearing quickly, spreading globally, and then fading just as fast. A pattern of systems that don't fully match the explanations given for them. The stations are still here, the rails still stretch across continents, the time system they introduced still governs daily life, but whatever deeper function may have existed, if it ever did, is no longer visible. Or maybe it is. Maybe it's hidden in plain sight, repurposed, simplified, reduced to something we take for granted. A fragment of a larger system, still operating in ways we don't fully understand. Because once you start asking these questions, one realization becomes difficult to ignore. We may not be looking at the rise of a system, We may be looking at the remains of one. And if that's true, then the real mystery isn't how these stations were built, it's what they were built for, and more importantly, what we lost when we stopped building them.